we cannot escape Herodotus. All of you remember how Amelie Kurt's source book, which has so many ancient Near Eastern sources, also has a hell of a lot of Herodotus in it. Just the case that these Greek sources are important, articulate, and self-aware takes on the Achaemenid Empire, which we all have to deal with. Herodotus, we also think of Ctesias, so it's a very great pleasure to introduce our second speaker, Dominique L'Enfant, a professor of ancient Greek history at the University of Strasbourg and the current editor of Ctima, I believe. Is that correct? Professor L'Enfant has many interests, has published prolifically in the field in ancient history, but also on ancient historiography, for instance, on fragments. She's worked on the author whom in English we call the Old Oligarch, and has in fact published the Bude on this author. She's published on gender, on ancient oligarchy, on ancient political history. But she has a particular interest in relations between Greeks and the Achaemenid entity. She's published on real interactions. For instance, IG 1 cube 227, the decree for Heracleides of Klazomenai, on which I think she's made a decisive intervention. She has also published, of course, a lot on Greek historiography in its representations of the Achaemenids. She has published the Bude of Ctesias. She has edited an important volume on Les Perses vus par les Grecs. She has also edited a wonderful book on, or edition of the fragments of Deinon of Colophon and another Heracleides of Chimere, which appeared in the collection Persica, the very handy little volume, and that has now been republished in an extended second edition in the Bude edition. This, I think, is enough to show you how much we should look forward to Professor L'Enfant's paper on the impact of the Achaemenid Empire on local Greek narratives, an overview. So it's all welcome, Professor L'Enfant.
Thank you very much. I would like to begin with thanking the organizer for inviting me. I would like to apologize because of my terrible accent. The modern history of the Achaemenid Empire has much to do with Greek sources, with Greek literature. Since the most prolific writings on the empire comes from Greek writers. For a long time, Greek literature was the main or even exclusive evidence used by modern historians discussing the Persian Empire, especially regarding its wars against European Greeks. Although primary documents such as cuneiform royal inscriptions and remains of royal residencies have been taken into account since the 19th century by historians of the Achaemenid monarchy, in the middle of the 20th century, Albert Olmsted was a pioneer when he conceived a history specifically devoted to the Persian Empire, relying on a variety of Near Eastern sources. The major turning point, however, was, as you all know, the creation of Achaemenid history, which first manifested in regular Achaemenid history workshops, bringing together historians from multiple countries and specialty areas with a groundbreaking ambition. One aspect of their approach was to broaden the scope of documentation to cover the different areas of the empire, that is to say, mainly non-Greek sources. They also developed a radically critical approach to Greek literature, contending that it provides an inadequate framework for understanding the Achaemenid Empire or spreads negative and misleading stereotypes about it. Since that time, the relationship between Greek literature and the Persian Achaemenid Empire has been essentially considered by historians of the empire in terms of the controversial use of the former as evidence on the latter. The present workshop provides a welcome opportunity to look at this relationship from a different angle, which has not been adopted so far, the impact they had on each other. The impact of Greek literature on the empire is difficult to ascertain. It was probably slight and at most indirect. On the contrary, the empire's impact on Greek literature was extensive, even if we limit the field of observation to the geographical ambit of the empire, as we are invited to do in this conference. For reasons of timing, I will just summarize what I have to say about Greek literature's impact on the empire, and I will focus then on the empire's impact on Greek literature. Greek literature's impact on the empire seems difficult to investigate with the available evidence. When the cities of Asia Minor were integrated into the empire, beginning in its earliest days in the middle of the 6th century BC, Greeks already had a literature, more specifically poetry, which was dominated by Homeric epics based on mythical tales of gods and heroes. Homeric poems were known to the Greeks of Asia Minor. It is nonetheless doubtful that this literature's audience could have extended to distant parts of the empire or to the court. There are Greek anecdotes which suggest that Persians were aware of the Trojan War. But assuming they are true, they do not presuppose an in-depth knowledge of epic poetry on the part of Persian kings. If we also consider Greek literature from the time of the Persian Empire, even through Greek testimonies, Greek literature's impact on the Persian court is difficult to establish, but likely to be small or non-existent. Greek literature, however, certainly had a major impact within the empire on Greeks themselves. The Greek language was a common ground of great importance between Greeks outside and inside the empire, as well as the cultural and political expressions it made possible. Herodotus is a most striking symbol of this, since his narrative was written after travels inside and outside the empire, partly influenced by the Athenian point of view. And it was read by Greeks on both sides of the Aegean Sea, for instance by Thucydides of Athens and Ctesias of Cnidus. This contributed to forging a shared identity, including for Greeks of the empire. Another possible impact of Greek literature may be suspected within the empire, even if not on Persians themselves. I am thinking of Anatolians, such as Lydians, Carians, Letheans, or Cilicians, who were neighbors and had regular exchanges with Greeks. Some natives wrote works in Greek, such as, for example, Menecrates of Xanthos, who wrote a history of Lycia in Ionic in the 5th or 4th century BC. To judge from the few available fragments, this work used many Homeric forms and phrases that were not employed by Herodotus, which attests to the author's familiarity with the epic. This diffusion of the Greek language and Greek literary models was probably favored by the fact that Greeks under Achaemenid rule could keep on practicing their language and having exchanges with their neighbors. To conclude this summary, Greek literature's impact on the empire ultimately appears to have been rather indirect. First, it had political effects, since it contributed to strengthening cultural affinities between Greeks of Asia and Greeks from outside. The use of the term barbarian to designate and depict the Persians and their subjects as diametrically opposed to Greeks suggested to Ionians that it was better for them to be under Greek Athenian domination than under Persian rule, Persian barbarian rule. Second, Greek literature might have contributed to smoothing the relationships between Anatolians and Greeks. In contrast, its impact is likely to have been very slight in parts of the empire without Greek communities. For its part, the empire's impact on Greek narratives can hardly be overstated. This conference is on literature within the geographical ambit of the Achaemenid Empire. But unlike with other cultural areas, focusing on Greek narrative within the empire is not easy because Greeks had a double specificity. First, there had always been Greeks outside the empire in Europe. Second, even the Greeks from Asia were not continuous subjects of the empire. As a result, much of the audience of these narratives lived outside the empire, and their perspectives were internalized by Greeks under Achaemenid rule. This was all the more the case as even the Greeks of Asia or Egypt were not continuously under Achaemenid rule, but became themselves outside Greeks for some decades during Achaemenid history. Greeks of Asia Minor then also had this double outlook, and they were also influenced by outside viewpoints. I will focus here on Greek literature produced by authors who were born in the empire in Asia Minor, and more specifically on their narratives and descriptions. It should be noted that Greek prose narratives and descriptions originated in Asia Minor and later spread to other areas of the Greek world. The confrontation with the Persian Empire gave a decisive impetus to an entire strand of Greek literature, which marked a new turn. Three successive trends can be identified. First, after the Persian conquest of Asia Minor with its Greek cities, the opening up to the multicultural world covered by the empire. Second, after the Greco-Persian Wars with Greeks of Europe, the intellectual reaction eliciting efforts to explain the origins and outcomes of the events. And third, the writing of monographies on the Persian Empire, which were no longer focused on Greco-Persian Wars. First, then, the opening up to the multicultural world covered by the empire. The very existence of the empire and its centralized power, as well as its material achievements, such as the extension of the royal network, fostered internal traffic and travels, interethnic relations, curiosity, broader outlooks, as well as an awareness of the limited place of the Greeks in this ensemble. Even if Greeks remained sailors with connections to the Aegean Sea and the Mediterranean, their inclusion in the empire led many of them to turn eastwards, or even to discover areas with the empire, which the empire sought to conquer, such as Egypt or the surroundings of Scythia. Herodotus says that when Cambyses made his expedition against Egypt, he took with him the Greeks who were under his rule, that they came in large numbers, and some, I quote, some probably for trade, others to fight in the war, and others merely to see the sights of this country for themselves. In the same way, when Darius made an expedition against Scythians, the fleets which came to help his troops cross the Bosporus and the Ister River was Greek. Before that, around 520 BC, Scylax of Carianda, navigator who was in the service of Darius, accompanied the king on the conquest of Gandhara. His mission was to sail down the Indus River until his ships came to the sea, so that Darius would know where the river flowed into the sea. Following this expedition, he wrote a Greek account on what the Greeks and Persians called Indike, or India, in fact the Indus Valley. We only have a few fragments of this account, that is, allusions by later writers. This was the first Greek account on that region of the world. It was probably different from the practical report the navigator had to make to Darius about the place where the river flowed into the sea. According to later allusions, the Greek text combined considerations on the landscape around the river, the relationship between kings and their subjects, and monstrous peoples with very large heads, only one eye, or feet big enough to shade their entire body. A century later, Ctesias of Cnidus seems to have been aware of this account, since such fabulous peoples figured in his own description of India. We do not know if he found it at the Persian court, where he spent several years, or in his native region around Cnidus, not far from Scylaxes. Herodotus claims that Darius discovered most of Asia, but the king was not alone, and the Greek Scylax left written traces, however meager and doubtful, of his own journey. Another example of this widening of the view beyond the Aegean and Mediterranean regions, where most Greeks lived at that time, and its impact on Greek literature, is that of Hecatæus of Miletus. He was born around 560, a few years before the Persian conquest of Ionia, and as an adult, he lived in the empire. He is considered one of the first Greek prose writers. His works are only known through fragments. He certainly benefited from the intellectual climate in Miletus, where, even before the Persian period, research and thought had developed on astronomy, meteorology, and other aspects of nature. Anaximander, in the early 6th century BC, has been credited with a map of the world, which would have been used and improved by Hecatæus. Hecatæus traveled extensively, especially in Egypt, and it is a reasonable guess that life in the Persian Empire in the second half of the 6th century BC inspired him to embark on these journeys. He wrote a description of the earth with the first part on Europe and a second one on Asia. He generally limited his description on the coasts to the coasts, the cities, rivers, mountains, and peoples of different races. In the part on Asia, however, he not only describes places on the coasts of the Black Sea, the Aegean Sea, or the Mediterranean, but also places in the eastern portion of the Persian Empire, and sometimes even inland parts of Iran, Central Asia, or near the Indus River, places that he would probably not have known without the Persian Empire. In addition to names and geographical features, he sometimes refers to the customs of local people, especially their clothing. Herodotus describes him as well aware of the ethnic diversity of the empire, since in 500 BC, when Ionians prepared their revolt, Hecatæus tried to dissuade them to do so. He says, in reciting a list of all the peoples under Darius' rule, in order to remind them the king's great power. This geographical and ethnographical broadening of horizons, as a result of being part of the empire, obviously also had a major impact also on Herodotus himself, a few decades after Hecatæus, whose work he had read. Let's turn now to the second trend I mentioned, the intellectual reaction to the Greco-Persian Wars. The experience of the empire also had another impact after the so-called Persian Wars with Greeks of Europe, in that it inspired a desire to understand and explain the origins of the conflict, as well as its outcomes. The Persian Wars were obviously a major rupture from the Greek point of view, including for Greeks of Asia, who were subjects of the empire and had taken part in the wars within the royal army or fleet. For Greeks outside the empire, in particular in Athens, which had been attacked twice and had inflicted defeats on the Great King, the Persian Wars were a powerful symbol of their own value, including in literature, especially in poetry to be performed in front of a large audience, as Scholos' tragedy The Persians is a famous example. Among Greeks originally from the empire, however, the events contributed to the birth of history as an inquiry leading to a story and an attempt at explanation. The ultimate preserved word in that field is obviously that of Herodotus. As it is well known, I will only point out a few aspects here. First, Herodotus described his story as a means to celebrate, I quote, the great and wonderful deeds achieved by Greeks and barbarians, and to elucidate the causes that led them to make war on each other. The Persian Wars may appear to have concerned above all Greeks of the Aegean and Balkans outside the empire. They were, however, a consequence of the Ionian Revolt, which took place within the empire, and Ionian Greeks had been subdued shortly after the birth of the empire. Herodotus' narrative traces the cause of Persian expansion from the origins of the empire, going back to Cyrus' childhood and the Median kingdom, to which he was allegedly linked through his mother. This account is based on a survey that itself draws on oral sources, which raises the question, what were these sources? Persian narrative must have existed. Stories on kings circulated within the empire, and Herodotus says that he had to choose among the many stories about the death of Cyrus. Darius' account of his seizure of the throne in the Byzantine inscription was not only engraved in 3 languages on the rock face of Byzantium, but also copied and translated in other languages such as Babylonian and Aramaic, and spread across the empire, as it has been reminded yesterday. Herodotus and some decades later Ctesias also recounted this episode with striking similarities, but also differences that might, in some cases, be traced back to Persian sources. Whatever his sources, Herodotus wrote a history of the Persian Empire up to the end of the Greco-Persian Wars, a history of which Greeks were first absent before becoming the main focus. This was the history of an expansion which came to an end with Persia's defeat and territorial loss. He strives to explain the confrontation with Persian expansionism, but also the failure of the Persians, which he attributes to the superior quality and values of the Greeks. The view of Persians as a dominating power with antithetical values, a barbarian world which opposed Hellenism and freedom, is a Greek interpretative filter that runs through his whole story. Another aspect of his work has a more complex background. At each stage of his account of the empire's growth, Herodotus describes at length the non-Greek peoples which the Persians subjected or attempted to subject, elaborating on their geographical environments and customs. This was a trend that can also be observed in the fragments of Hecateu's description of the earth, but is also in line with the royal ideology. In his official inscriptions, the great king boasted about the ethnic diversity of his empire, citing not only the number of its peoples, but also the variety of their origins and languages. The decoration of royal palaces even goes further, since Persepolis gift-bearers are grouped into delegations with distinct ethnic characteristics in terms of dress, headgear, hair, and physical features, as well as the objects they carry. This certainly served to illustrate the extraordinary extent of the king's power, but also reflected his policy of maintaining ethnic particularities. In Greek literature, it is certainly no accident that curiosity about differences between peoples was exhibited by subjects of the Persian Empire, such as Hecateu's and Herodotus. Herodotus and his audience also provide a good illustration of the connections between Greeks from inside and outside the empire. The man traveled in some parts of the Persian Empire, but he also went westwards through the Greek world, spending time in Delphi, Athens, Sparta, and southern Italy. Born in the Persian Empire, which was also his main area of investigation, he then lived outside of it and brought an off-center perspective to it. In the same way, he had an audience both inside and outside. His work was disseminated within the empire, at least in cities which belonged or had belonged to it. As already said, Ctesias of Cnidus read it, since he obviously competes with it and sometimes explicitly argues against it. It also found its way outside the empire, where it was partly composed. Herodotus himself performed public oral readings of passages, and Thucydides is said to have heard him at Olympia as a child. Maybe it is not true. Yet, what he said about the Persians was often more nuanced than the comments of outside Greeks, largely dominated by the spectre of the Greco-Persian Wars and the associated cliché on the barbarians as poor warriors and servile subjects of a cruel despot. Even if his work included such stereotypes, it was not limited to them. He even liked to tell stories that turned cliché on their head. If we admit that the Persian Empire had an impact on his work, this impact spread far and wide. The last significant movement I would like to comment regarding the empire's impact on Greek narratives is the writing of monographies on the Persian Empire, which were no longer focused on Greco-Persian Wars, but rather on the empire's internal history. These works have been labeled Persica. As far as we know, there are 6 in total, dating from the aftermath of the Persian Wars to the last years of the empire. They were all authored by Greeks who were native of Asia Minor or neighboring islands, places which have been under Persian rule at one time or another, at least until the Persian Wars. Dionysius was from Miletus, Charon from Lampsacus, Hellanicus from Lesbos, Ctesias from Cnidus, Heracleides from Cumae, and Dinan probably from Colophon. The first 3 of them wrote in the 5th century BC after the Persian Wars, and are actually likely to have written before Herodotus completed his own work. In any case, their Persica were independent of his work. All these works are only known to us through fragments, a fact that explains the uncertainty and assumptions surrounding them. The Second Persian War seems to have been the initiating event, and in the First Persica, it had a place, perhaps a major one, in the narrative. Nevertheless, even in the first one by Dionysius of Miletus, the Persians were also considered for earlier events, unrelated to the Greeks. For example, Dionysius referred to the revolt of the Magus against Cambyses, Charon to the flight of Pactyes in front of Cyrus, and Hellanicus to Cambyses' brothers, or the murderer of Cambyses' successor. In the 4th century Persica, the Greco-Persian Wars are relegated to a minor place. This is clear in Ctesias' case, and it is even not certain that they were addressed in Heracleides' work. There is a literary cause for this. These wars had been covered in detail in Herodotus' narrative. There was also a historical cause. Many things had happened since then in the Persian Empire. There were at last individual factors, such as the opportunity to hear stories from Persians themselves, or even to witness certain events. 4th century Persica turned towards an internal history of the empire that stretches to the author's own time, such as Cyrus the Younger's rebellion, for example. Possible motivations were the sensational potential of court stories and revolts, which seem to have received the lion's share of the attention in Ctesias and Denon's Persica, the attraction of the Persian Empire in the minds of Greeks in general, and the assumption that there was a potential readership. In any case, Ctesias and Denon were very prolific authors. They wrote respectively 23 and maybe 30 books, many more than Herodotus' 9. It is impossible to measure the extent of their readership, but there is no doubt that these writings circulated both outside the empire, Xenophon alludes to Ctesias' work, and among Greeks inside it. Denon's imitation of Ctesias and polemics against him attest to the fact that he had read his work. The Achaemenid Empire was this author's place of origin, as well as the subject of their writings, and the reader's interest was linked to the prominence of the empire in the political and mental Greek world of that time. At least, it is striking that no more Persica were composed after the fall of the empire, and that the existing Persica ceased to be copied. They became rarities and eventually vanished. As a conclusion, Greek literature pre-existed the Achaemenid Empire with narrative aspects which are not attested in all cultures, but the empire led local Greek writers to explore new paths, to write in prose, drawing on oral investigations into the vast world of the present and the past, especially the past of the Persian Empire. Given the overlap with primary sources, it is tempting to think that they based their Persian history on a Persian narrative tradition. A major incentive was certainly offered by the forced contact with the empire, beginning with the Persian conquest of Asia Minor, the consecutive interactions with Persians in that region, the increasing opportunities to travel eastwards, and sometimes to stay at the court. Then, the upheaval caused by the Persian Wars resulted first in decades of independence from the empire, second, in a reorientation to the West amid political and military dependence from Athens and its influence stance on Persian as enemies and barbarians. Last, even after reintegration into the empire, authors continued to describe its court and history in greater detail and claimed to do it better than their predecessors. They undoubtedly assumed the existence of a readership with an interest in this empire, which remained particularly powerful even beyond its borders. As a response to the Achaemenid Empire, Greeks of the area developed forms of geography, ethnography, and history which would probably not have been conceived without it. This can be considered as a manifestation of the development of local cultures within the empire. It is also noteworthy that in Asia Minor, Greek literature was a pioneer compared to the much better-known Athenian literature, whose authors only began to write history in prose later. In this sense, it could be said that the Achaemenid Empire was a chance for Greek literature and culture in general, both inside and outside the empire. Thank you very much for your attention.